I've gotten out of college and I throw like basically no harder than when I got here. What needs to change for me to play pro ball?
First off, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate you having me.
You know, the purpose of this is really like our directive that we're trying to accomplish is uncovering, you know, what does it actually take to create peak performance? And, you know, a lot of times that's not just physiology. A lot of times that's not just, you can't just grit your way through these things, right? So there's a lot of like all that. And we're trying to do so in a manner in which like people can apply it relatively easily, and not easy from the respect of like, oh, it should be easy to gain this, but like easy from the respect that like it's not these super complex scenarios that are going to create these actual benefits for you. So that's like general purpose. Initially though, I really want listeners and then ourselves to even learn more about you, you know, and sort of how you got to where you are. And then we'll dive deep into like, you know, your methodologies and what you believe in and why you believe in them. Obviously like doing some homework on you. I love the fact that strength coach first and then, you know, meshing into now like taking over this. And we're obviously going to dive into like, you know, worked with Loyola men's lacrosse team. And I'm sure there's more than that, but I love the concept of having the capacity to take from other things that you've done and bring that back into this sport, because I think ultimately that's where this sport has started to sort of explode, right? You know, the data didn't necessarily come because all of a sudden one day somebody woke up and was like, "Oh, we should do data in baseball," right? Like there's a lot of other sports that have been incorporating that. Golf, right. And, you know, and hence the birth of TrackMan in baseball. But cool. So let's do this. Let's start off with, why don't you just give me a little overview of, you know, you have this great facility, brand new now, right? In the last little bit.
Yeah. So the facility's like 2.5 years old now. So we moved in, kind of middle of COVID. Yeah, it was fun times. Like end of August, 2021. So now we're actually looking for a bigger space, and that has been, I think we may have briefly talked about that, but that's been a project, man. Like finding a space that fits, because like they're technically, you know, mid-size or small spaces, even really in commercial real estate. And so like finding a 10,000 square foot space in the area that I want to be in it's been a challenge. There just isn't a lot of inventory. So like there's lots of office space, right? Nobody needs that anymore, right? But there isn't a lot of like basically warehouse space. Yeah. So that's been a challenge, but yeah, no, the facility's great. It's just too small for what we need. Like once a day at least, I have 5 or so guys come up to me and they're like, "So when are we moving to a bigger space? It's kind of crowded in here." I'm like, "Yeah, it is. You're right. I'm looking. If your parents know anybody, if you know anybody, like send it my way, please." But yeah, no, facility's good. It's been fun. Like I think we have a cool environment. I don't know what your guys' hours are like, but we typically go late, right? So guys can come in after school, because during this time of year, right, we got college guys back and some of the pro guys will filter in from remote. But for the most part, it's the high school guys. And so like they'll come in after school and we'll have guys just stay till the end of like basically closing. So we have guys hanging out for 5 hours. And like I appreciate they want to do that on their Friday. It's been cool.
Culture is an amazing piece of it, right? Because no matter how good of a coach we could be, that peer-to-peer relationship that they're going to get is going to weigh 10 times more.
Right. It's been cool because like some of the guys who didn't know each other coming in, because obviously a lot of the guys have referred each other, but some of the guys who didn't know each other coming in, they all had like a big like get together of basically just like TAP guys last night, like separate of their other friend groups. And I was like, that's a pretty cool thing. So, but yeah, no, it's fun.
Yeah. Very cool. So, all right, let's backtrack before we are even thinking of doing a training facility or anything like that, right? Talk about, you know, transition out of playing career and into, hey, what do I want to do now? Because that's a daunting realization that, frankly, a lot of people listening, a lot of players we're currently coaching, are going to have to come to terms with at some point in their career. So what was that transition like? And you know, what did you end up pushing towards, and how did that shape where you are now?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like a pretty muddy transition, honestly, because I still wanted to play for longer than I was like really getting opportunities to play at that point.
Sure.
So I was a super late bloomer. So I didn't throw above 90 until I was at least 22. I wasn't in the mid 90s till I was 24 or 25. So like the opportunities that I was getting as they would get a little bit better were not getting as much better as they could because of my age. So like I was kind of fighting that the whole time. And like eventually it got to the point where I was 26 or 27. I'd played 3 years, played 3 years in indie ball. And I wanted to kind of like take that next step. I was throwing in the mid 90s. My stuff was all right. But I was basically going to have to throw 100 more or less to like get a real opportunity because they have 18 to 22 year olds who are better than I was and threw harder than I did and all that kind of stuff. So
let me take a second right there because I want to unpack why you feel now transitioning, like use the brain that you have now. Yeah. Why were you such a late bloomer? What do you think caused that?
Oh, dude, I know exactly why. Yeah. So when I was like coming up, I was always a guy who threw hard, like for like my local area or my team or that kind of thing, but not like in a broader sense by any means relative to the guys I coach now, like not even close.
Which is amazing.
But yeah, but there was
humbling.
Yeah, right. But there was like kind of a turning point where I was in high school. And to that point, I thought I was like working hard and I was, but I was kind of just spinning my wheels. So like when I was in like 7th grade, I was like, you know what? I'm going to get better at baseball. So I started like riding my bike around the neighborhood. So like that was like my introduction to like endless, like, you know, glycolytic activity, basically like super hard exercise that doesn't actually make you better at baseball. So I did a lot of that for a long time, really until probably like my senior year of college when I was like, man, this is dumb. Because the whole time I'm like reading about all this stuff. And I'm like learning as I go. And I get to a certain point where like my knowledge and what I'm doing are like not matching up. And I'm like, man, this is really dumb. I was like 21 and I was like, well, you know, like I kind of want to see where I can take this. Cause like I've gotten out of college and I throw like basically no harder than when I got here. Like what needs to change for me to play pro ball? And so I started kind of going down this rabbit hole. Cause to that point I was personal training, like kind of on the side while I was playing. I had Fridays off at college. So I would go train at a gym and then come back for practice. And so I was like, I know I want to be in that world for sure, in the strength and conditioning world. And then when I was like, man, I really got to start throwing harder. Like this is my last year. I know I'm going to need some time after this to really get where I need to go to get an opportunity. That's when I started going down kind of the rabbit hole of like learning way more about throwing, specifically the biomechanics side, all of that. And how do we train for that? You know, kind of found the smartest people I could at that time. Was like, let me go learn from these guys. So I found first a guy in Philly. His name's Phil Donnelly. I think he's probably retired now, but he was like originally the AT and PT for the Phillies when like Kurt Schilling was there. Mm-hmm. And so when Kurt Schilling went there, he had a bunch of injuries, wasn't right. Phil kind of helped get him right. And was kind of like the person who kind of brought to the forefront that like, hey, when we see an elbow injury or some kind of like distal arm injury, it probably starts more proximally. Like we're looking at kind of like the scapular shoulder complex, something along there before we get to the elbow. And we're like, why is he having this issue? So he was kind of the first person to do that. He started doing some of like the throwing specific training. So I went up there, I would meet with him, you know, every couple of weeks. I'd have homework to do on my own. And then I would come back and meet with him, tell me how I was doing. And so we did that. And then from him, I met Randy Sullivan at the Florida Baseball Ranch. So I went down there and at first I was just like going to train, learn as much as I could, like myself. And then I was like, man, I really want to stay. My grandparents lived like about an hour away. So I was staying in their house. So I had a place to stay, rent free, thankfully. And so I was talking to Randy and I was like, hey, like I really want to stay, trying to find a job down here. But like I have this background in strength and conditioning. Just let me run it for you. We'll take it out in trade. Like, just let me train for free. He was like, all right, I need somebody to do this anyway. Sure. So I ran the strength and conditioning at the Florida Baseball Ranch for a while, started doing some throwing training there as well with the guys who would come in. And then I had this window because we would have morning groups and then nobody for like 4 or 5 hours. And then we'd have the evening groups. And so in between, fully my time. And so that was when like all of the other floor trainers and stuff were helping to train me. I was picking their brains. I could talk to Randy without anybody being in there and being crazy. got to like kind of dip my toe into like this pretty elite player pool because they're outside Tampa. And then we had pro guys and stuff coming into, but that, I mean, even just the high school guys there, it was incredible. It was like, it's nothing like the, mid-Atlantic where I am at least. And so that was really cool getting to kind of train this like more elite population, get like a kind of some insight into that. And then I learned a lot about throwing. And I was able to be like, okay, let's think critically about the stuff that I think is great. Let's think critically about the stuff that I think I would change and why I think that. So I got to pick Randy's brain. He was like, hey, he introduced me to Franz Bosch stuff in like 2015 or 2016. So it was like, let's, go down that rabbit hole for a little bit. So it was really good to kind of get this background from all these other people. And just the whole time kind of reading, studying on my own, doing all that stuff, and then training myself and, having like a real world example of what do the results look like. And so kind of figuring out in real time, like what works, what's the line that I could push this to without getting hurt? Because like while I was doing this, I had like some minor injuries and stuff like that. Sure. So I was like, okay, here's about where the line is in terms of like frequency and intensity and volume for me. Like, how does this apply to other guys? What can I take from myself to them? And so like I found out for myself that like super low frequency of high intensity stuff worked really well for me because those high days would be crazy high, right? So I'd go in for like a throwing session. It's like, all right, how many times can I throw above 94 in this bullpen? And then like, what am I going to need before I can recover and do this again, hopefully at a higher level? And it was like, well, for me, it's like probably about 7 days. Like if I tried to do 2 in a week, that next one, no exaggeration, my numbers would be down like 10 miles an hour. And so I was kind of like, if it's meant to be high intensity, is this like serving that purpose? Like I'm not really deriving any benefit from this because I'm not creating enough stress for it to matter. Like I'm just digging myself this deeper hole that I'm never going to get out of. And so then my next high intensity, which is supposed to be the actual meaningful one, is going to suck again. So that was kind of where I was like, okay, not everybody can handle these 2 days a week where we have like in a typical like driveline type model where you have the plyo testing and then the like maybe mound testing or pull down testing or whatever. Like not everybody can do that. Not everybody can do 2 pull down days a week, whatever it is. Some guys may need to go once every 10 days. Like you kind of need to figure out what works. And then certainly as you're getting, if it's a guy who's once every 10 days, as you get closer to the season, you got to figure out how you can move.
So wait. Let me slow you down because you're killing it right now, and I want to unpack so much of that. Like let's go back to your coming in now, but I love it because you know why? Then what you get to see is you get to see the passion, you get to see all these really cool moments that you went through in your life that you got to experience, and I can see it on your face how those are shaping what you're doing now, and like what you're seeing in certain guys, and everybody wants an individualized program, which I love how bastardized that is in this world because
really good for sales, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could give the exact same program across the board and it's different for every single kid because of what you just said. So going back, right, you're in high school and college and you're going through that and you're learning and you're realizing, hey, some of what I'm doing just flat out wasn't working, but you had this come to Jesus moment, which is like this humility moment that I think, unfortunately for you at that point, it happened too late, right? It happened at the end of college where you were like, wait a minute, I have been doing all of this and I haven't gotten actually any better, right? And I think in those scenarios, you have 2 questions to ask. Was it me? Or was it what I was applying to me, right? And then you really have to try and unpack all of that, sort of what you went through. And I thought, as you were going through that, then what you said or what you told us was, hey, I started seeking out these people that I thought were incredibly intelligent and almost in, some other ways that maybe you hadn't been exposed to yet. And I think that's the ultimate intention, I believe, of what most people in our industry are trying to do with social media. And I think the dichotomy of social media is that the attention span and the want for that information in such a condensed period of time provides this sort of false security that I'm doing or I'm seeking education as hard as you just talked about. You just talked about basically living with no paycheck, fighting a way to get into a facility that you thought was really reputable at that time, which they still are. I'm not saying it like that. And then did anything possible to seek information the idea that I'm going to get that off of a social media post is mind-blowing. I mean, it's my hatred for what we have to go through in order to sell.
And to even get the opportunity to be in front of him to be like, hey, I know enough to do this for these guys who are trying to make a living doing this, was like the amount of reading that I had to do and study on my own and all that stuff in the background. Like guys will frequently ask me in the gym, be like, how did you learn this? And I'm like, well, every single weekend it was higher before I was doing as much of the business stuff as I have to do now. But like, there's an hour every day that like I'm just studying and reading, and it's like specific to whatever topic I'm exploring at that moment. But like when you stack that up over the course of 10 or 15 years, like it just compounds, right? And then all of a sudden you can become, not to say that I'm like the biggest expert in the field, but like you can become an expert relative to where you were for sure. So it's like that's what it takes to get there. And if you're not willing to go that hard, whether it's playing or learning or coaching or whatever, then like you're not going to get to where you see everybody else being and where you want to be.
Yeah, you were incredibly insightful to do that in your early 20s, because I can tell you, coming out of college, my first inclination, just type of household I grew up in, was like, get your ass to work. And like that dream's done, start making money. And in retrospect, it was almost tough for me because I'm 5 years in and now I realize, wait a minute, I'm not as smart as I think I am. I don't know enough, which led me down my path to like, let's go get my master's, doctorate, and realizing that, higher education might be a little bit of a fraud too there, but, it still needed to be self-driven, right? This education effort. And it's ultimately the foundation of any successful individual is how willing they are to suffer through the process of not knowing what they need or they feel they need to know at that current moment. So I commend you for that. But now let's take it. So like now we're back at Florida Baseball Ranch, and we're going through these processes where you're learning because of yourself, right? You're putting yourself through that. And that's always one of those statements where, we'll hear a lot of great coaches that are out there now. They'll be like, oh, you needed to understand how to throw 95 miles an hour to understand what it takes to do that. I don't disagree. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing that you can always relate back to. I would say for myself, who has never thrown 95 miles an hour, I just needed way more athletes then in order to try and come to those same resolutions that you were coming to, right? Because I needed to test these theories and these concepts way more to find out, what does it really take, and how can you push somebody, and when do you need to pull back? And I think it's the biggest struggle is deciding where that line is and understanding how to toe that line. So you start to discover that, hey, multiple of these in a week is just not going to fly for me, and I need to space these out a lot better. How do you, as you're now coaching that, you're the strength coach there at where are we, 2015, you said? Okay. So we're still in the realm though, where those two domains exist separately at that moment in time. Yeah. Like they strength and conditioning with strength and conditioning, stay the fuck away from our throwing development, and like basically just don't mess us up. How did you navigate that, knowing you're going through it at the same time and you have a breadth of knowledge in that area?
Yep. So it's one of the maybe helpful selling points was that a lot of the guys, even if they're advanced on the throwing side, are beginners on the strength and conditioning side. So there's a lot of opportunity without, relatively speaking, very much risk at that point, because you can give them such low level stimuli and such low volume and still see them get better that you're just like, hey, give me a couple months with these handful of guys, and let's see if this makes a difference, right? We'll measure these specific things. We'll see if they get better, because we know, based on what you and I both believe and what we've tracked, these have a pretty strong correlation to mound velocity. So let's see if we can affect it on this.
It's amazing what a highly skilled, untrained athlete can make a strength coach look like. Yeah. I know.
And so like that made it a little bit easier, but still getting with some of the advanced guys. Cause like at that time, and I'm sure this is still probably the same way with a decent number of guys, but there were some really, really, really talented guys there, like 7-figure bonus guys who had never looked at a weight in their life and they threw 98. And so then you get some of these younger guys in here, or the parents in here, or even some of the other trainers in there, and they're like, well, is this really like important? And you're like, well, clearly it's not the most important thing, or everybody would have to do this, right? Like, let's think about with pitching velocity, like what does it take to actually throw? Like, what do we know it definitely takes? Well, you have to throw. Outside of that, there's nothing that's really mandatory because people are doing so many different things. Right. But we do know, like if you understand physiology and those kinds of then biomechanics, those kinds of things, that these things can definitely help if done in the correct way. So it was just kind of like selling it as, this is why we're doing this. Like, I'm not just going to do stuff to make these guys tired. Like, this isn't going to be the equivalent of running poles, but in the weight room. Like, I know that they don't all need to deadlift 600 pounds, like totally aware. Let's like actually make measurable changes in these specific areas, and let's measure the outcomes by some like kind of proxy that we know probably affects throwing velocity, right? So whether it's like a med ball velo or some kind of ballistic push-up or a jump variation, like whatever it is, let's have a measure that we use to know that the weight room is making a difference. Mm-hmm. And then if we're seeing the radar guns still go up and the guys are still staying healthy, provided the throwing program is reasonable, which we're hypothetically also controlling, then we know this is probably like doing a good thing, or at least not harming them.
Sure.
And maybe it's providing some kind of protective mechanism as well. Right. So like, let's kind of stay with this. And so I had to kind of approach it that way. And we had to go which helped me practice for now, honestly, because I was selling it to somebody who had a pretty good knowledge base already. So like, it made it relatively easier selling it to people with less of knowledge base. You have to pare down your approach a little bit, but it made me think really deeply about like, why are we doing what we're doing and what are we actually going to do to make these changes? And that's kind of how we started. But I mean, yeah, even at that point, it was kind of an uphill battle because everybody wanted to do like the stuff that was hard or entertaining or whatever. Like, they didn't want to take the 2-3 minute rest periods between stuff to like fully recover and maximize the output. So like, that was still a hard sell. That's still a hard sell now. Like, I'm sure you see that with the guys, right? Like, it's like you're walking around, you're like, either somebody's resting for 15 minutes and you're like, hey man, get to it. Or somebody's resting for 30 seconds. You're like, hey man, you're breathing a little too hard. Like, let's chill. Like, here's what we want from this. And so at that point, it was still the case. It was just less widespread than it is now. And there were certainly less people combining the skill and strength and conditioning side. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me, because it's like, what if we did both of these things at a world-class level instead of just one?
Right.
And so that was kind of, but yeah, it was not an easy sell.
Yeah. Yeah. I can, like, at the end of the day, we're really just having a conversation about, what's going on in this industry and like how this industry has sort of evolved, and we're seeing it just through your lens, you know what I mean? And which I think is incredibly valuable, because you're working with some high level guys. You've worked with a ton of high level guys over your career, right? You got yourself to be a high level individual. I think what better sort of both anecdotal and then like scientifically based, because you have to take both of those in. Sure. Like, somebody who's going to sit here and be like, oh, I'm only going to do what the study's doing. And then like, okay, great. But you're like, I mean, like, yeah, one of my best friends who's been on this, Dr. Brandon Erickson, the guy produces a research article while he's talking on the phone with me. And he'll be the first to say, he's like, yeah, that's like perfect world scenario in a lab. And there's so many variables outside of that we can't account for. But anyway, so getting back to, the idea that there's a specific way that we can balance these two. And I mean, we don't need to overplay the struggle that has been from a strength and conditioning side to now allow that to come in. But I would also say, as we get more intertwined, I think there tends now to be an even bigger pullback from even the strength coach that truly starts to understand the throwing side of it, and they start pulling back from what they're applying in the weight room. How has that sort of dynamic been for you now, coming from the strength world and almost having to deaden, I know personally, having to deaden some of the things maybe I've put myself through, maybe that I've seen work for other reasons.
Yeah, that was maybe one of the things that I learned a little bit later on. And that went kind of hand in hand with like, hey, how often can I apply this like really high intensity throwing stimulus? It was also like, what am I doing on the strength and conditioning side that's like either not letting me access this level that I want to get to, or is like actively keeping, like pulling me back down, right? And so that was when I had to kind of also realize that the throwing side is, like we kind of talked about, the most important thing and the only thing that's non-negotiable. Yep. From there, everything else is like, well, it kind of depends. And so for me, that was kind of like when I realized if I'm going to be in a really heavy period of throwing, and this is like a duh moment at this point, but not a thing that I had realized at the time. I just kept my strength conditioning pretty much the same. It's like in season, like I can handle it. Right. And it was kind of the thing where like, no, I need to do like way less and I can maintain what I've built with way less. So like, why am I going to like, I'm not going to make meaningful change in the weight room, like during a season where I'm like in games 3 days a week. Right. Like I'm just not going to. And so like, what can I do to make sure I keep me at the highest level possible so that I can get promoted and get out of where I am right now to where I want to go? And so that kind of began in the off season. It was like, okay, well, what if I have 2 kind of main strength and conditioning sessions a week? It's like, okay, that worked really well. What if I like apply like a third optional one depending on how I'm feeling? And if I take like pre-session measures to see how I'm like recovering, right? Like grip strength, vertical jump, something along those lines. It could be anything. For me, it was med ball velo, but it could be any of those things. Sure. And then can I do this optional, like maybe potentiating session in there? Like, okay, that worked really well. Can I apply more? And the answer ended up being no, but like, that's kind of how I did it. I pulled it all the way back to like 1 or 2 sessions a week. And then I built it back up from there. And we did a similar thing with throwing, kind of meshing those together. But that's really been the thing for me, because we do still have a lot of those guys who come in who love the weight room. That's awesome. Like, I'm really happy that they do, because it means a lot of good things are going to come because they're going to be consistent with their training throughout this period of time. But those are the guys you have to pull back, and you have to be like, hey, when they're in season, like especially the remote guys, because you can't see what they're doing every single day. So you're checking in with them, you're having them fill out the workload stuff, like all that kind of stuff where they're tracking it. But we have to be like, hey, here's the reason we're not doing more. Here's the reason, like, we don't want you to be sore the next day. Like, here's the reason, like, we're doing this. And here's the reason throwing is taking like the priority.
Right. You have to create that buy-in based off of the type of individual they are too.
Yeah, but that was something that I definitely learned later, and I had to fight my own desire to just do all of this stuff in the weight room. Because like when I first started, when I got to college and I got these huge strength gains because I had never trained consistently before, I would lift for 2 hours every day, and it was like, oh, this worked really well when I was like 17. Yeah, and I wasn't throwing very much, and like I wasn't tracking my velocity. But like now that I'm 25 and I throw much harder and I'm much stronger, like I'm applying so much stress in these, they can't be 2 hours and they can't be every day. So like, where do we go from there, and how do we know how much we can reasonably do without digging ourselves too deep of a hole?
I think potentially one of the most important things right there that you just mentioned is like, this really worked for me at one point in my life, I think, because if I don't have metrics, like these external metrics that are ultimately, and backing that up, probably even more important is that the number one thing that's going to help me throw the way I want to throw is throwing. So understanding that, keeping that at the forefront, right? Because listen, you got guys that are what you were mentioning before, the guy that's going to take 15 minutes versus the guy that's going to take 30 seconds, right? You got the soldier and the TikTok superstar, right? In the weight room, you got the guy who's like after every single rep, he's posting it to Snapchat and like blah, blah, blah. And then you got the other guy who headphones on, dark glaze, eyes rolled back, and he's just ripping. And that guy's probably got some good demon that you need to tap into when he's getting on the mound. But like ultimately, like you're saying, you got to pull him back. And the buy-in that you're referencing, right? Teaching a guy, this is why we're not doing these things, becomes incredibly difficult if you don't have metrics to back that up, which is like one of the things we harp on with most people. You don't have to train with us. You don't have to train with any of these great facilities you see. What you do need is an evaluation. You need somebody that understands how to evaluate you to at least give you a roadmap of where you need to run down. And then you need to make sure you're taking some metrics on a regular basis, because going at this thing blindly is perhaps the greatest way to get into a position where you are frustrated because you have progressed not at all. Or worse, you got yourself injured because you thought what you were doing was 100% accurate. And I think we see this scenario so often from guys, and I'm sure you do too as well, where you get them and they're lost. They're like, dude, I've just given everything and I've gotten nowhere. I don't understand what is going on. And they're vulnerable. They're really in like this weird place. And I think from now when you've transitioned to then coaching, what made you make this choice? Obviously, like you would have kept playing if you can keep playing, right? Everybody would, but at a certain point we realize where genetics are getting us, potential is getting us, and you start hitting the ceiling. And then ultimately the greatest limiting factor in the world is age and time, right? And that catches up. So this transition now to coaching and becoming, this high level coach, what drove you to want to do that?
Yeah. So I kind of knew that was where I wanted to stay, was kind of like driving performance in some way. Two, honestly, playing got a lot less fun as I went on, to the point where, because I always thought I would always have this thing in the back of my mind where like, I really would rather be playing than coaching. Sure. And it changed to the point where I was like, I don't really want to play anymore. And I'm getting way more enjoyment from coaching. And so it just kind of pushed me there. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to have this other thing to go after like a complete psychopath instead. And it's going to be this now.
Divert the attention.
Right. And so it kind of went that way. And so it was like, I'm going to still keep training on my own. Like I'm going to still try to throw 100 if I can get there. But I know that I'm probably not going to get signed by anybody. Like it's fine. I'm not worried about that. I'm not trying to become the best pitcher. I'm just going to see if I can throw 100. Like that's what I'm going to go for. And then it got to the point where like I wasn't having a ton of fun even doing that anymore, but I was like, training other guys is really fun. And like I've learned enough doing this now. I've pushed myself enough now. Like my body could handle what it could handle. And I've gotten a lot of benefit from kind of seeing that in myself and feeling that and knowing what these guys are going through, where now I just want to go the coaching route. Like I know what I messed up and I wish I had somebody kind of guiding me when I was there. Because I do feel like I had an opportunity to probably have my career turned a little bit differently. Like not to say I would have been like a 10-year big league or anything, but like I think I probably would have gotten some opportunities, certainly out of college, if not for like a better place than that. But so I wanted to kind of help guys just not make the same mistakes that I made, because I know how frustrating it was and how like mentally draining it is to be like, man, I am working my ass off. And like I see that guy over there and I know I know what he's doing because we're boys. And he's so much better than me. Like what could I be doing? Because I know I could get better than him, but like, what is it possibly going to take? And I have no idea. Like, I'm just going to keep banging my head into the wall and like, hopefully that helps.
Yeah. A good buddy of mine, Dean Jackson, says the greatest regret he has is not having a high level coach at a younger age. And he's like, and then obviously he turns that around and says the greatest mistake a young athlete could do is not have a high level coach at a young age, especially if you have the resources. So let's go into that last little bit that you just said there. So there's this frustrating moment in time for a lot of guys where they know they're pounding the pavement, right? They're the guy out there that's grinding. They're out beating everybody, right? And unfortunately, there's a genetic freak that sits right to the right of them. And I mean, they break every single sort of system that you've put together and everything, and they just are outperforming. Have you run into this now as a coach? And how do you navigate the difference between these two types of athletes?
Training them?
Training.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the guys who are freaks, it also kind of depends on age and that kind of stuff a little bit. But the guys who are freaks, obviously, like, and depending on how old they are, because you have these guys, right? The guys who are...
I love how you're going. I know what you're doing. You're going through, what does this guy look like? How does he look? Because the true answer is it depends. Yeah. Right. So like, I appreciate you trying to fight that.
Yeah. The guy who is at risk of like getting released the next year from his organization, his program is probably necessarily going to be a little bit riskier than the guy who was the first round pick and has a $9 million bonus. Like your job with those two guys are very different. Right. And so it depends on that. Obviously our younger guys, right? Like we kind of talked about, like I think Mike Guadango says like, you're going to slow cook it. Right. Right. You can't unburn a cake, but you can always put it back in the oven. And so that's kind of like how I view it with almost everybody. And then there comes a point with certain guys, like the guys who are trying to make a push to be a pro, right? Or they're trying to get back in an organization. They're 25 and we're like, hey man, you need to be 95 to 97. You need to we need to dial in the sweeper. Like these are the two, you're going to be a reliever, but we need to get these things right. And you got 5 months to do it. Like that guy is getting pushed. And like the risk of things breaking become a little bit better. So as long as everybody's on the same page, that's maybe okay. But that guy versus like the 8th grader who throws 90 miles an hour is a little bit different, right? That guy, you're like, okay, we're going to give him minimal effective dose. We're going to educate him and his parents about what he can and can't be doing, because every coach that kid has is going to want to be like, he needs to pitch every game for me. It's like, these games don't even matter, one, but two, like, let's be reasonable in terms of his dose here with this. And let's make sure we protect the kid for the long term, because already just by being that good, throwing that hard at that young of an age, he's already at a huge risk. And so and it's really hard to be like, hey, be a little bit worse than you are, right? But like, you have to kind of fight that urge, just be like, I'm going to make this 8th grader throw 100.
It's such a battle. That's such a great point you bring up, because there's so many different dichotomies with that scenario, right? We have one in the building right now. You'll get a chance to see him a little bit later. And referencing before, when you're like, hey, you have this high effort day and then you need 7 days off. I love the cake analogy, but slow cooking him. I mean, I think 12 to 15 where we've been like, I'm back. We've shut down the summer like super early, because the riskiest player on the field is a skeletally immature, highly skilled athlete. Because it's just, they're not going to hold up. And when, again, I'm going back to my buddy, Dr. Brandon Erickson, is like, when asking him, what's the greatest factor to prevent an injury? And the easiest way to do that is don't have a previous one. Right. Like, if you have a previous injury, you're more likely to be injured again in the future. And it's amazing that there requires so much education there. And it's his network that needs to be educated at that point in time, that 8th grader, because it's generally not them, right? No. Your biggest problem with peeling somebody back like that is crushing the competitive nature, right? And I think as a coach, ultimately our job there is, I always say this, I think our job as a coach is to create an environment, right? Our job is to manifest this environment that they can flourish in. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not the one throwing the ball. We're not the one lifting the weight. We're not the one running the sprint, whatever the hell it is that we're asking them to do. Yeah. Our job is to create the environment that then they can figure out how to navigate within and give guardrails and make sure that path is transitioning the right way. So when we're taking somebody like that, right? So let's assume you have this 8th grader, right? He throws significantly hard. What do we know right off the bat about an 8th grader that throws really hard? He's a great rotator. It's got to be, right? It's impossible not to be throwing that hard, right? So talk to me a little bit about how that changes your training approach in the weight room, because recently, and I'm going to have him back on as our director of strength. He's had, as any great coach, has had these moments where they're like, I feel like I don't know anything. And he's like, I looked back at like some of these programs that we're doing, and he's like, Nick, how'd you let me program this years ago? And I'm like, well, because it was years ago, and years ago I thought we were right. And but how does taking sort of that approach where you realize you have this kid, how different is your program? Let's say with a kid who is not a high level thrower at that age, right? Is really skeletally immature, is, a novice to the weight room. How different does that program look?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think kind of like off the bat, one of the things that we're really careful with is kind of exactly what you said, with like, there's periods where they have 10 or 15 days where they really don't push the envelope. So with these guys, one of the things that we put in place, just because of how many times I was burned by it. And then like, I went down the rabbit hole of the research. I was like, I'm feeling this. I wonder if there's like papers about this. Sure enough, there are. But one of the things that we do is if guys have a PR of 3 miles per hour or more, is kind of like the benchmark that we set, they automatically are not throwing hard the next time they're scheduled to. Like, they're having an automatic deload. It's non-negotiable, right? And when guys are like, oh, I feel really good today, I'm like, that's awesome. Save it for next week. Like, here's your cap today. Get X number of throws in. We're going to do this, this, and this, but you're not going over this velocity. And so like, we've been really, really strict about that over the last couple of years. Because when I first started, if somebody did that, one, I hadn't kind of like put that all together yet. But then two, if somebody was like, I feel really good, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, let's let it rock.
Yeah, we're going to do that.
And it's amazing too, right? That like, because that's sort of the, I don't want to say the ego of the coach, and believe me, we've been there. the ego of the coach, but it's almost the excitement of the coach. Everybody has to remember, a coach doesn't go into anything with bad intentions, right? The objective of the coach is to get this kid exactly what he wants.
Yeah.
And
like, oh, he's feeling it today.
Right. Yeah, let's fucking rock this thing.
Awesome. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's our job to be those guardrails.
Sure.
And that's why, creating that environment, creating that scenario.
Conversation yesterday, I was like, with like 3 different guys, like, I'm protecting you from you. Like,
Yeah.
because they were like legitimately pissed. And I was like, I love that. I love that you're upset, but it's not changing. Like, I will take the ball bucket away from you. Like, that's how this is going to go if you don't listen. And it had literally one guy, I had that exact conversation with yesterday because he like wanted it that bad. And I was like, look, man, I understand. Non-negotiable. Yeah. Like, next week, it's going to be awesome. And you're going to be like, man, you were right. Or you're going to be like, oh, you were wrong. And I'm going to be like, well, I protected you from you. And like, you feel okay right now.
Yeah. Listen, risk reward. We were there. Scenario, right? Yeah. You were in the same boat. Good luck.
It's a battle, man. But yeah, with the 8th grader who is a stud versus the young guys who are like completely novices to like everything. With the guys who are complete novices to everything, we're giving them exposure to as many different possible things as we can. Because generally the guys who come in and you see them and they're like, you do like the throwing assessment. And you're like, man, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Like, what happened to this kid? It's they started playing baseball generally relatively late compared to their peers. They've been maybe overcoached by some of the coach dads who have them, which, like, again, well-intentioned, but problematic for their long-term development. Sure. And then also they probably haven't played a ton of other sports. They don't have this like great movement base to kind of build from. So we're like, okay.
Their movement blueprint is pretty narrow.
Yeah. And so we're like, look, this kid isn't going to be like light years better in a year, but a year from now, we will have set him up that beyond that, he can be light years better than he is now, because we've kind of set this base that he didn't get over the last 8 years.
Which is brutal to try and educate when you're talking about, hey man, you're in 8th grade, you're in 9th grade, like, just stay the course, dude. Just stay the course. Like, you don't need to be throwing the 100 right then. Go ahead though. It's such a brutal conversation.
And it's often with those guys, if they're complete novices, you have so much stuff to go back and teach them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so like with we have a whole group of middle schoolers. And so kind of the first thing that happens when they come in first, it's all built around sprint, jump, throw stuff. Like they're going to do all of the high velocity elastic stuff first. And then because worst case, if we run out of time at the end of the session, like their parents are there to pick them up, we're like, hey, we got in the most important stuff for today. But they are then gonna, because that's kind of your window of opportunity for speed development, your limb velocity can improve, all that kind of stuff. And you can't get crazy strong because they just don't have the horn. Yeah, right, exactly. It's not there yet. They haven't developed. So we will kind of set the baseline for movement though, so we can load these things down the line. So they'll go through a series of isometrics over that first cycle or 2 cycles, right? And they will complain. But like then from there, they get to go through like the movements they actually want to do. And we're just pretty conservative about it. So like the reps in reserve look very different for them than they may for other guys, that kind of stuff. We're very, very, very strict about technical failure before anything else. And that's kind of how it'll go with those guys. Whereas like with a well-developed 8th grader, they do already have this base built. So I'm not going to push them back to there if they already have experience there, but they are going to get, again, still this kind of slow cooked, pretty general program on this side. And if they're only playing one sport, they are still going to get this more kind of well-rounded exposure to various activities, movement patterns, that kind of stuff that they're clearly not getting from their practice. The good thing for us has been, to this point, all of the guys who are like, absolute beasts in middle school are the super well-rounded guys, right? Like because they're good, nature versus nurture kind of thing. I think they're really athletic, so they opt into all these sports probably, but like they play a bunch of sports. They are getting this well-rounded movement base that we don't have to be like, okay, we need to check all of these boxes at once. It can be like, hey, we're going to give him this, this, and this. We're going to make sure that he's getting a little bit stronger each time. We're going to make sure that we're limiting, the high intensity throws that he's making, on this kind of time cycle. And we're going to make sure that we're tracking as many things as we possibly can and educating him, his parents, and his coaches about this. But we don't have to go back and do all of these things because he's already checked that box, thankfully.
It's an incredible dynamic, Lord, sort of question there, which is like, oh, is it the fact that kid's a 3-sport athlete that makes him a great athlete, or is it? Yeah, and I see you shaking your head, and I completely agree with you. Just go back and look at genetics, and parents were probably athletes, and and here's the other thing: when they're like, oh, well, you should be playing multiple sports. Well, he's probably not playing multiple sports because he's not good at it.
And he doesn't like multiple sports.
Right?
Like multiple sports? Yeah, please. Go play multiple sports. But like otherwise, again, we can check that box in your training. If you only like one sport, just make sure that everyone around you knows you're only playing that one sport. We'll get you better at that stuff. But like Julius Peppers isn't great at football because he also played basketball, right? He is an amazing athlete and would have been good at any sport he chose, right? Like if you go back and look at pictures of like Myles Garrett, there's a picture of him from high school and he's 6'5" and completely shredded. There's a picture of Myles Garrett from high school and he looks almost exactly like he does now, maybe 20 pounds lighter, but like basically like he does now. He's huge and shredded, and he's next to like the most stereotypical high school football player there ever was, like this kind of short, chubby kid, and they're both shirtless. And it's just like, yeah, Myles Garrett was always going to be Myles Garrett. Like it doesn't matter that he played 3 sports, like that he ran track and that he played basketball. Like, no, like if you like multiple sports, there's a benefit to a certain age of playing multiple sports, but it's not the only way to get that benefit. And at a certain point, if you're not Myles Garrett, Julius Peppers, these freakishly talented guys, that's who you're competing against. And if you don't take the time to basically train for that year round, like let's think probably 9th or 10th grade, you're going to be behind and you're not going to become what you want to become. Like,
well, what I love too is think about the sports you just mentioned, right? So you're talking about football, right? And you're talking about a position, D tackle, DN, whatever, right? And then you're talking about a sport that like there's technical skill, but nothing, not even remotely close to something like baseball. I mean, like, and especially narrowing it down to a pitcher, the magnitude of reps and time you need doing that movement pattern is insane. So there's a reason those guys look inept when you give that freak athlete a ball to go and throw. Like it's incredible. So listen, and the other side of that is this. There are also those type of humans in baseball, and they're the guys that would have been a pro regardless of if any coach ran into them or not. And they're just freak genetics. But circling back, so I love getting back to this concept of rest and high effort and managing the difference between all these types of athletes, because that is actually the individualization of a program, right? We can have the exact same concept, scheme, whatever, but recognizing what the metrics, hopefully taking some metrics, what they're telling you about this individual is what makes it individualized. Communicating with the athlete is what makes it individualized. So going back to like even that 8th grader, or let's just talk about you, right? I like understanding or getting an understanding of where your thought process lies in terms of central peripheral fatigue and how that's actually impacting this athlete in terms of, we see an injury, right? And everybody likes to say, oh, it's central nervous system fatigue, right? But when we look at papers, that's seemingly recovered in a 24 to max, 48, 72 hour range. Like really not that drastic of a recovery period. Yeah. So like this peripheral fatigue must be that magnitude then. I don't know. What thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's really important to, as much as possible, kind of like measure those things. And so you can kind of use tests that are proxies for either one, but like for the peripheral side, like for example, we had a guy come to us referred by a physical therapist post rehab, and his doctor had been like, oh man, like your rotator cuff's really weak, and it's weaker on your throwing side than on your non-dominant side. And I was like, okay, like let's test though. We're going to test it as part of your assessment anyway. Let's just test it right now and then we'll know for sure. And not only was it not weaker on his dominant side, he was maybe 10% off of like our normative range for end range external rotation strength. I'm just kind of like, well, we're doing this with like manual muscle testing. Like we could do so much better.
What are you testing that with?
We're testing it with a Tyndek.
Cool.
Yeah. So, and
which is like an ISO.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like a little wooden thing that you have hooks on either end. Yeah. And so we'll hook it to the rack, and they'll do it. We'll set them up in the same position. And so we tested that, and I was just kind of like, they could easily. I mean, the 10 deck it's under $300. I don't remember how much it's under $300. Like a doctor could easily just have this in the clinic and have one of his medical assistants run them through this test at the beginning if he's even thinking that this is an issue, right? But instead, he's like the standard things like, oh, your rotator cuff's weak and your core's weak. And it's like, well, what do those things even mean? Like, we're going to measure both, and I could tell you whether they.
How do you measure the core's weak too? By the way, just looking at his belly and.
Right, exactly. We're going to hold a plank for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, no, it's the same kind of thing. So so we can measure peripheral fatigue with that, and you can do different stuff with like grip strength testing and that kind of stuff. You get even really specific with the finger strength testing and that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think that the central nervous system fatigue is often overblown unless you have a guy who is, on his own doing stuff that you don't know about, or they're playing like 18 different sports where they have a game every single night, or he's like running track and it's, 100-meter meets every day and stuff like it's pretty rare that that's a huge issue. Like if somebody comes to you and they're like, it's supposed to be a high day and they're like, hey man, like I'm not feeling it today. Like you're obviously not going to make them test, and you can easily pull that back. But like outside of that, like, it's probably not that much CNS fatigue if you're programming it in a reasonably intelligent way.
Yep. And I would say, just so that everybody's clear too, like central fatigue would be central nervous system fatigue, which would just mean like your neural adaptations, your signaling, everything is going to be bad. So the rate at which you can fire might be down, the timing of that might be down, all of these things. Whereas peripheral is going to be much more muscular driven and even, fascial driven at that point in time. And you're going to have somewhat of an issue of exerting the force magnitude or potentially absorbing the force in the manner in which you want. Central fatigue, where we have seen, and I'm not even going to pretend to truly understand this mechanism, where we have seen guys come up with ailments, and I'll call them ailments because a lot of times people can recover from, people throw a high effort bullpen day and expect to have no ramifications of that or like stiffness, stinging. You're going to be sore for you just unlocked a new level to your body, right? Like nobody has a problem when they hit a fucking max bench and they're like, my chest is exploded, dude. And I get it. I get that like pitchers have this. And I'm not trying to ignore that, but there is this idea that you just tried to do something that was uncommon for you. There's ramifications to that. Let me put it this way. There's consequences, both good and bad. Consequence doesn't necessarily mean negative. Yep. 100%. And I would say where we see most of the issues come in tends to be in a training environment, because obviously we can talk about an array of common issues that we see once they leave us, which is largely because the environment is massively changing. The control of the environment is massively changing. But when we see the biggest issue in-house is during this sort of middle time period of like, especially in the Northeast, where it's cold and everybody's got a cold. And when we get a kid that tries to hit a PR or tries to do something and they haven't made, the coaching staff aware, or, they weren't, they didn't feel it or whatever, that they were sick. And this, I mean, it's every time that we come up with something like that. And it's like, oh yeah, I had a massive cold the last like 3 days. And it was like, we didn't think to say anything about that. Nothing. They're like, why should that matter?
Right. Staff you up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate you.
I'll just go ahead and take
yeah. But like we have seen how that cold, which again, like, I guess I can like, assimilate through like, oh, you're not recovering when you're sleeping. And like, there's a likelihood of, different, your, whatever, white blood cell counts probably high, your recovery period's all messed up. Sure. We can go down that whole path, but like ultimately at the end of the day, something is affecting their central nervous system and it's affecting how fatigued they are. And ultimately it also affects their capacity to respond or recover after that. And I think that has been one of the most challenging things, especially when dealing with young kids, is managing that communication, that feedback, that, and And there's not really a good metric for it. We have tried to work with Whoop. They're an impossibly difficult company to work with, because I will say this. I think oftentimes, the sleep stuff is moderately overblown and then probably causes more good than harm. But when you do wear these things long enough, it typically tells me when I'm going to be sick before I'm sick. And it gives me at least a day's heads up. And if the coaching staff was aware of that and had the capacity to notice that, I think you could probably get ahead of some central nervous system fatigue, some potentially, they have it, but they want an arm and a leg for it for no goddamn reason. But this is my pitch to them if you're listening, help us. But in all honesty, I think this balance of, understanding what's going on in the athlete and their capacity to communicate, again, I'll revert back to, creates this sort of individualization, right? And they are ultimately the beholder of how individualized this program can possibly be. Because no matter what, everybody listening, you need to understand this, you are getting a template. You are getting that template because this template, based on science, has worked. The only way it gets adapted is you.
Yeah. Also, if you're getting something that's 100% individualized, it probably isn't backed by anything. Yeah. Your best case scenario, you're getting bucketed into at most probably one of 4 buckets realistically. And from there's going to be some minor tweaks based on what pops on your assessment and that kind of thing. But it's not going to be anything crazy, right? It might be if we have somebody doing, some kind of lower body ballistic movement, it's okay, well, you might have an all concentric one. You might have a band assisted one. You might have an accentuated eccentric one. We may adapt it that way based on our elastic utilization ratio or something. We may do our mobility filler may be a little bit different for this guy than this guy. Sure. But outside of that, most of it is relatively the same between similar types of people. Yep. And that's how it needs to be in order for it to work. Right? You know what I mean?
That's
so
what people need to understand. It's not going to work if it's not like that.
And if you track all your workload stuff, we can do even better with that. So we have all these workload tracking tools for all of our remote guys, especially. And if any of our in-person guys want to use them, I'm happy to give them to them too. I can see them in person. It's less of a big deal. We can talk about stuff and we're tracking stuff as we go. But the remote guys, I want to know about throwing workload. I want to know about workload in the weight room, and I want to see what the rolling average looks like. But if they're not tracking that, it makes it a lot more difficult. But it's really come in handy in the past, kind of very similar to what you're saying. We had a guy years ago, one of my first remote guys, and he was a stud. And he, his velo was down for a couple of weeks, and it was right around December, beginning of December. Okay. And so we're going back, and he'd actually been tracking his stuff. And it was oh man, your sleep is all out of whack. Your subjective measures of recovery are all out of whack. What's going on? He's I'm worried I'm going to fail this one class. And so I've been up studying. So he's getting 3 hours of sleep a night. He had gotten sick actually. So we gave him a 10-day to 2-week deload. And then next week he came back and he had a 5 mile an hour PR. Yeah. And it was this is why the workload stuff is so important, or at least some method of tracking where what you've been doing, so we can look back at historical stuff and be because worst case scenario, at some point, or best case scenario, at some point in your career, you're going to play long enough where you're going to go through a period of time where you're going to suck more than usual. And you're going to need to be what was I doing when I was at my best, or even when I was consistent? And if you don't have that, how are you going to know what that was? Because it's not going to be something general I was doing safety bar squats. That doesn't matter. Right. It's how frequently were you training? What did your sleep look like? What time were you going to bed? What was the ratio of ballistic stuff to heavy loaded stuff? All of that kind of stuff. What was getting you right? How frequently were you training? What was getting you right? And then can we go back and kind of recreate that environment again? But if you're not tracking stuff, it makes it really, really hard.
Yeah, it's completely subjective then, right? It's all off your opinion. And largely what's crazy and what people don't understand, when they're looking back at the past and they're looking into those things, you're actually involving a ton of your current biases in what you thought occurred in the past. And that is what's insane. And you actually start to reshape what you think you did in comparison to what actually may have happened. Right. And if you don't have anything to go back on with that, you're lost. And you're simply just guessing and probably applying these biases that are massively incorrect. There's we can keep going on and on forever. You yelling at me over here? Where are we at? 10:30. I want to hit so many more things though. All right, let's do this. It would be impossible to, we're having you on here. We've dove so much into physiology and everything, and I could have another 2.5 hour conversation on that. What's your belief in terms of velocity, right? Because this is the conundrum for everyone, right? I mean, hell, it's in the name of our company, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not going anywhere. And it's going to be needed. I mean, it makes the sport significantly harder for the hitter, period. End of story. So how do we untap this in your objective of where you're looking at each guy? Where are you addressing first? How are you moving through this process?
Sure. Let me give you like my overarching kind of theory opinion about all that, and then how we actually assess guys. So the first is like, I kind of have a couple of like broad buckets. So we have like the technical side, we have the neurological side, and then we have the physiological side. We've talked about the neurological and physiological a little bit. So like within those buckets, just real quickly, right? We have stuff like, rate coding and things like that on the neurological side. And then on the physiological side, we have like fascicle length, right? These fascial adaptations, the kind of connective tissue adaptations as we go through. We have fiber type shifts. We have all of that kind of stuff that we can derive from training. And so those pieces are very important, right? And then on the technical side, we have like, how do we get to and through these positions? And that involves those physiological and neurological pieces as well, but it's kind of a separate bucket because we're going to train those generally in a more general sense and these in a more specific sense, right? And so that's kind of where we'll go, is like technical, neurological, physiological. And so within those kind of pieces, the way we'll assess guys, we'll do like our basic movement and mobility stuff first, right? So we're looking at passive and active ranges of motion. We have normative ranges from research and from our in-house stuff. And we're like, hey, we should be about here, right? There's bandwidths for it, but we should be about here. And we can differentiate between loose and tight movers to some degree, but like somewhere in this range. And then from there, we'll have just like some basic movement competency stuff. Like, can you do these movements we're going to want to load down the line? And then with the younger guys, a lot of times we'll take them through like some more dynamic movement type stuff and just see like, can you skip while doing an arm circle, right? Can you skip while doing an arm circle on one side? Like that kind of stuff with the younger guys. With the older guys, we don't do that as much. So then we'll get everybody.
Why is that?
Because those guys are generally developed enough. If they're like a baby deer, I may go do that. But like, you're not seeing as many giraffes on roller skates by the time they get to be like 16, 17, 18. When they're in 7th grade and they're 6 feet tall, you get a lot more of that. So we're like, hey, this is a really simple direction we can go. It's going to help them long term. And if we just add some of this basic stuff into like the warm up and play period, it's going to be huge for them.
This is so I sort of baited you on that because the blueprint isn't as refined, right? Like their movement blueprint isn't there. And this is why we're always harping on people like, don't come to me at 18 and, expect the world. Like, yeah, maybe once in a blue, like you're going to get that guy to all of a sudden unlock some magical thing with some pixie dust. But like ultimately at the end of the day, if you're giving me from 7th and 8th grade, we can make this thing happen.
Agreed. I love having the long-term guys because you don't have to deal with, for the most part, sometimes you do, the coaches who have screwed them up to that point, right? Like they're pretty much a blank slate. And so you get to just be like, hey, this is awesome. Whereas you get guys when they're 16 and they've had, pitching coaches sitting on a bucket, tossing them a ball, being like, there's a balance point, and like just worse things than that, but just top of my head. Whereas those younger guys, you get to just kind of like take them through it. But so then we'll get guys on the mound. We'll get video from 4 angles. We'll do velocity baseline. Depending on when they're coming in, we may do the full arsenal and the Rapsodo, but that's generally a later thing that we'll do. So we'll go through mechanical analysis, about 60 points that we'll go through. And so we'll just kind of rate them green, yellow, red, really simply. And then we'll make any relevant notes. We'll come back to that. And then we go through a force velocity profile. So they're going to do a series of ballistic movements for the upper and lower body. We'll do some med ball throws with kind of an even distribution of weights. We'll do stuff with and without the stretch shortening cycle. And we'll do the same for the lower body. So we're looking at, the spread of the ball velocities or the jump heights or distances. And then we're also going to look at the difference between with and without the stretch shortening cycle. So we can use like the elastic utilization ratio as well. And so we can drive programming kind of really specifically from there. But so the mechanical analysis and the mobility side, right? They have to work together, because if we're looking for guys to find specific positions to kind of move to and through, if they physically can't access them, we have an issue. So we'll kind of have to, those pieces will have to work together, but that's kind of how we'll lay out the program then from there. Is they'll have everything when they come in from their like movement and mobility prep, right? Where they'll have the self-myofascial releases first. They'll have, end range isos or dynamic mobility stuff, central nervous system prep. Then they'll get into their throwing for the day, right? And that's where we're doing the specific kind of constraints work, main work for the day, and then on to the strength conditioning, which is going to be driven by the force velocity profile, and then what their weight room experience looks like, right? I mean, because we're going to do the force velocity profile for everybody generally beyond middle school. But what we're going to look at for the guys who have like absolutely no training experience is different than what we're going to look at for the guys who check the strength boxes already, right? The guys who check the strength boxes, we can drive the training based on the force velocity profile. The guys who have never looked at a weight in their life, like it's going to be more general regardless. And we're using this as a baseline just so we can test and retest and make sure that we're moving in the right direction. But that's generally how we'll do it. And so we're trying to affect the technical side, the physiological side, and the neurological side.
Love it. So when I'm going to go back to the pitching breakdown, right? And you're talking about the mechanical breakdown, you got your 60 points. How much of that conversation is actually happening with the athlete about those 60 points? And how is that broken?
Yeah. So anything that they do moderately well, we generally don't touch on. The stuff that really makes them special, we'll generally go over and be like, hey, you're really, really good at this. Don't change this. Don't let any of your coaches change this. No matter what they say, send them my number, right? This is what you don't do as well. And this is what we're going to work on for this first cycle, these first couple of cycles, right? Because it's going to take a while for this to change. You've thrown one way for 16 years, 22 years, whatever it is. It's not changing overnight, right? We don't get rid of an old pattern. We're putting a new one on top of that. It requires more reps and higher quality reps. So it's going to take you a minute. And so we'll go over that. In some cases, it may help guys to have like an MLB comp or something. And so for those guys, we'll do that. Doesn't happen for everybody. If they're asking for it, then we'll generally go through that. But like we have a guy right now, a high school kid. He's a good player. He's a two-way guy. And he throws hard, like nearly 90. He's a rising junior. And his lower body is straight up elite. Like not a thing I would change, like elite. And his upper body is complete garbage. And it's just like he's just locked up. So he's like the loosest mover in his lower body, right? All of the bait and scores, like he's checking that box. Upper body, stiffest mover, right? Like doesn't rotate, doesn't extend, doesn't flex. The external rotation's not there. Internal, like he's just a brick. And he's a very good athlete. And so he's not going to ever probably be the loosest mover through his upper body, but he's so stiff, it's restricting all of these motions. So it's just like he gets in a really good position with the lower body and the upper body's not giving anything. Like his layback is like almost vertical. It's like just doesn't exist.
So how do you think then that manifests itself? Like, okay, obviously if he doesn't have layback, I'm assuming that's measured in both passive and active, right? So even the passive has minimal range there. Oh, wow. So the obvious thought process there then is this person's probably not retroverted, right? Going to be really the issue.
So I'm like, when did he start playing baseball? And that was why that was a weird thing for me, because he started at 5 or 8 or whatever, like a normal age. It didn't stick out as like, that's the reason. So it was like an interesting thing. So we've been doing the, all the, SFMR stuff. We've been doing mobility work. Like he's got a mobility, the whole series he has to do on his own daily. We've been doing like some fascial stretching and stuff, generally twice a week.
How old?
He is 17. So, and he's gotten some manual as well. And so like, it's getting better, but it's a slow process. But like with him, we've specifically talked about like, hey, lower body is elite. Don't let anybody change this. Upper body needs some work. Here's what we're working on. Here's how it's going to slowly, and it is slowly getting better, but it's a process. So we've kind of like really, he was just like a good example. Yep. We've kind of dialed in what he needs to know, what he wants to know when he runs into an issue. Here's likely why this issue is happening. Here's how we're going to get past it.
So he's also seeking why is this the scenario,
sure,
right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's a good thing because then I'm like, hey, here's why, and here's what I need you to do on your own, because like we just I don't see you enough to do this, right? Like you got some stuff you're going to have to do on your own. Like 10 hours a week here is not going to be enough. Hit some of this separately, and we've timed it out so that it works around his kind of higher intensity days and that kind of stuff. But so we'll give guys as much information as they're looking for generally, and try not to do more than that. Because I don't want to like overload them and superdome them. So like with the remote guys, generally we're looking for video once a week, once every other week. I'm not looking for like every video from every session, because then they're like, oh, well, like this one throw at like 65% effort didn't look very good. Like, well, yeah. And here's the reason for that. But like, we don't need to see everyone. Like, focus on your reps. Don't worry about the camera, and send me some stuff as a check-in here and there, and we'll talk through it. And so that's kind of how we try to do it, just because baseball players tend to, pitchers especially, just really get in their own head. Right.
Crazy. Yeah. Cool. So let's finish up with this. If you have advice for a young athlete that is, put yourself back in your shoes, what are you doing? How are you getting there? And remember the maturity level that you had at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think where I would start is kind of exactly what we talked about towards the beginning, is like, you need to find a qualified coach. And ideally it's the same person doing, both the kind of the technical side and the general side. But if not, find the best person you can on each and make sure they communicate. The reason it's helpful if it's the same person, or at least the same kind of group doing it, is then they're talking, they are accommodating the stress well, right? Because if you have a strength coach kind of doing their thing, just whatever they want to do, and then you got the throwing coach doing whatever they're going to want to do, it's eventually going to become problematic.
It's amazing the way this field has manifested strength and conditioning. Like, you used to just be able to be a guy that was really into the physiology. You can go in and let the weights bang. And now it's, well, guess what? You got to be the skills coach too. And you got to be the psychologist, the nutritionist, the, everything for this individual. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think getting with somebody who can kind of help drive your development process and is willing to be like collaborative with you in the way that they're like going to take your thoughts and desires into account. Autonomy. Not that like you're the expert and they're going to be like, yes, that sounds like a good idea, we should definitely do that. But at least taking that into account and explaining why either that is or isn't a good idea, or how we can accommodate that thing, right? Like, we had a guy over the summer who like was super strong and like really loved hitting heavy stuff. And so like every now and then I was like, I know this feeds him. He doesn't need it. Right, like dude legit had a 600-pound deadlift. He doesn't need it. But every once in a while, I'm going to let him do this because this is like a potentiator. Yep. And sure enough, it worked really well as that. Like, we had velo numbers off the charts for him. So like, it needs to be collaborative to some degree, that you're taking their thoughts and feelings and those kinds of things into account, because in order for them to get as good as they possibly can, they have to be in it for the long term. Right. And this is kind of going back to the middle schoolers. Our biggest thing is just like, is this fun? Do you love showing up? Because if the answer is yes, they're going to get as good as they can be over time, because they're going to show up consistently over the course of years. If you hate it, you're not coming back and you're not going to get as good as you could. Right. Yeah. So like it's the same with older guys, but just in a slightly different way. So you have to take kind of like what they think, what they feel.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're hitting the same note, which is, in order to get it as individualized as you can, you better be interested in being collaborative with it. Yeah. You better be interested in taking control over your career.
What showcases do you have coming up? What, when's the next game? That kind of thing. And like, oh man, I don't know. I got to ask my dad. And I'm like, no, man, you need to know this. Like, this is you and me working together, not me and your dad. So, like, let's get on that. So yeah, if you're interested in the process, if you're, willing to kind of go all in, yeah, you got to be on it with your coach so they know what's going on too.
Great. Awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, man. Appreciate it.